You've probably imagined how you might die. A car crash, a sudden illness at 80, something dramatic with warning signs, maybe even a hospital bed and people you love standing around it. But the real answer, if you had lived almost anywhere on Earth 20,000 years ago, is far stranger. And it's far worse than you think. Not because it was more violent, though sometimes it was. Not because it was more painful, though often it was that too. It's worse because of how ordinary it was. How early, how ignored by the story you've been told about your ancestors. Start with your teeth. Right now, in your mouth, there's a tiny crack or a spot of decay you've never noticed. In your world, that's a minor annoyance, a trip to the dentist. In theirs, it was a death sentence. A cracked molar could open a path for infection straight into the jaw, then the bloodstream. No antibiotics, no painkillers beyond a chewed root. Just swelling, fever, and a slow shutdown of the body over days or weeks. Researcher Gwen Robbins-Shug, who has spent years studying skeletons for signs of disease and violence, has documented just how often ancient remains show these small, silent killers. Not spears, not lions, teeth. Here's the thing you were never told in school. Prehistoric death wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. The body simply ran out of small repairs it couldn't make. Now think about being born. You made it. Somebody didn't. For most of human history, roughly a quarter to half of all children died before the age of 5. Not because early humans were careless parents, because a fever that your child would sleep off today with medicine and a warm bed was often unstoppable. Diarrhea, pneumonia, a simple cut that turned septic. These weren't tragedies that struck occasionally. They were the baseline, the expectation. Families didn't grieve less. They grieved constantly. And it didn't stop at childhood. If you were a woman in almost any prehistoric population, pregnancy itself was one of the leading causes of death. Not old age, not disease. Childbirth, a breech birth, a hemorrhage, an infection after delivery. Any of these could end a life in hours. There was no surgery to fall back on, no transfusion. Just other women doing what they could with their hands and whatever plants they'd learned might help. Anthropologists estimate maternal mortality in some ancient populations at rates dozens of times higher than in the modern world. Imagine knowing that roughly 1 in 20 pregnancies might be your last. Would you still choose to have children? Most people did, because there was no alternative story yet. Survival simply meant trying anyway. Then there's the myth you've probably absorbed without realizing it, that early humans died young because their bodies simply wore out fast, like some cruder, shorter-lived version of yours. That's not quite right. Their bodies could last. What killed them was everything around those bodies. Researchers Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee examined fossil teeth from different points in human evolution to estimate how many individuals lived long enough to become grandparents. Their findings, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showed something remarkable. Older adults were rare for most of human history, not because aging itself was different, but because so few people survived the earlier, more dangerous decades to reach it. The dice simply got rolled too many times before anyone reached 50. So when you picture a caveman dying of old age at 30, you're picturing it wrong. 30 wasn't old age. 30 was already an achievement, something closer to a small miracle of avoided infection, avoided childbirth complications, avoided a bad fall, avoided a bad decision at exactly the wrong moment. But maybe the most uncomfortable truth isn't disease. It's other people. For a long time, a comforting story circulated that early humans before agriculture and cities were mostly peaceful. That violence was a modern invention, something civilization brought with it rather than something civilization tried to contain. Then, in 2016, archaeologist Marta Mirazon-Lar and her team published findings in the journal Nature about a site called Nataruk, near a lake in what is now Kenya. There they found the remains of at least 27 individuals, including women and children, who appeared to have died together in an act of coordinated violence roughly 10,000 years ago. Some had fractured skulls, some had projectile points still embedded in their bones. This wasn't a single fight. It looked, to the researchers, like a massacre. Why does that matter to you? Thousands of years later, on a random day when the biggest threat you face is a delayed train, because it dismantles a story that's comforting precisely because it's false. Humans have never been strangers to organized violence. The instinct to compete over land, water, and resources is not new. It didn't arrive with kings or armies. It's older than farming, older than writing, maybe older than language itself, which means the version of ancient peace you might picture, small bands sharing berries under a gentle sun, was, at best, occasional. At worst, it was a pause between conflicts you'll never hear about, because no one survived to tell the story, and the bones speak in fragments. So what actually killed early humans, if you had to rank it? Not predators, though they mattered more in some regions than others. Not starvation alone, though it played its part in lean seasons. The real killers were smaller and closer than you'd expect. Infection from minor wounds, complications from childbirth, disease that traveled fast through close-knit groups, and violence from other humans defending or seizing the same scarce resources you depended on. Death wasn't an event waiting at the end of a long life. It was a constant presence, woven into ordinary days, arriving through the smallest cracks. Here's where it gets strange in a different way. That constant exposure to death may have shaped how you think today, right now, in ways you don't notice. Some researchers argue that human psychology evolved under exactly this pressure. The pressure of a world where a scraped knee could be fatal and a stranger could be either an ally or a threat. That's why your body still reacts to minor cuts with disproportionate anxiety. That's why a strange noise at night can spike your heart rate before your conscious mind has even processed what you heard. Your nervous system was built in a world stacked with these small, real dangers, and it hasn't fully caught up to the fact that most of them are gone. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If your ancestors' greatest threats were mundane, a cracked tooth, a difficult birth, a raid at dawn, what does that make your own anxieties, the ones that feel so enormous to you? A missed deadline, a social rejection, an argument left unresolved. None of these will likely kill you. But your brain, inherited from people who couldn't afford to underestimate small dangers, still treats them like they might. So the next time you feel that spike of dread over something small, remember where it came from. It's not a flaw. It's an heirloom. A leftover survival instinct from a world where the smallest wound really could be the beginning of the end. You've probably imagined how you might die. A car crash. A sudden illness at 80. But now you know the real answer, at least for almost everyone who came before you, and it wasn't dramatic at all. It was quiet, early, and far closer to home than you ever thought.